In the program, you will have seen that Nicola Bonucci was scheduled to moderate this panel. I'm not Nicola. My name is Tara Junta. I'm a partner of his at Paul Hastings. He had an urgent client matter. And so I'm honored to be able to sit in. I won't say I'm going to fill his shoes by any measure, but it's a pleasure to be here. As I said, I'm a partner at Paul Hastings. I'm in the DC office. I sit in the investigations and white collar department, and I co-chair with Nicola and John Drimmer and Renata Perez our ESG and human rights practice at the firm. What I am really is a corporate governance lawyer, and for 36 plus years have been advising companies, boards of directors, corporates, executives on how to identify, mitigate, and address hopefully in a preventive sense, risks presented to that company. That has been, not surprisingly, heavily in the anti-bribery, anti-corruption space, business ethics. But with I think every single engagement I've done, it's never a single issue, or rarely a single issue. It's got overtones of a sanctions issue, a HR issue, a cybersecurity issue, privacy issue. They're all converging, and they seem to be converging even more significantly these days. The role of gatekeepers in all of those challenges and opportunities is an interesting, a nuanced, and important challenge, and one that I'm looking forward to participating with the panelists and with you here today on what is really meant and how can we address the gatekeeper challenges and opportunities. We're going to start. I'm going to introduce the panelists to you. Then each of the panelists is going to give their opening remarks. I have some questions for the panelists, and then I am looking forward to your engagement and questions that you may have for the panelists. It is always a very interesting conversation in all of these sessions, so I'm looking forward to that. To my immediate left is Katja Bechtel. Katja leads the relationship with companies, governments, international organizations, and civil society for the World Economic Forum's Partnering Against Corruption initiative. She's been with them since 2019, and she's also responsible for their relationships with Transparency International's Global Integrity Program. To Katja's left is Scott Hanson, and by the way, thank you, Scott. This is the IFAC managed session, so we're here at your invitation. Thank you.
Katja did most of the real work.
Okay, there you go. Scott is Director of Policy and Global Engagement for IFAC. He covers a broad range of issues, including bribery, corruption, money laundering, economic crimes, as well as capacity building initiatives on behalf of the organization. To Scott's left is Sara Carnegie. Sara heads Legal Policy and Research Unit at the International Bar Association, where she does many things, wears many hats, but among them collaborates with external stakeholders, including the UN, OECD, EU, and World Bank, on a wide range of issues, including business human rights, anti-bribery, corruption, rule of law, and cybersecurity. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Delia Rubio. Delia is with Transparency International. She's chair and former chair of TI Argentina, and she is currently consulting on a broad range of areas, including anti-bribery, anti-corruption with international organizations and NGOs. So thank you also, Delia, for being with us. So I think what we're going to do is start. Katja, I'll hand you the clicker, and then you can kick us off.
Yeah, sure. So this session is about gatekeepers or enablers, so it has a question mark already. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work that we have been doing at the World Economic Forum. So about 2 years ago, we have created a task force, a cross-sectorial task force, because the gatekeepers universe is actually quite diverse. Normally, when we talk about gatekeepers slash enablers, we think about banks, we think about accountancy firms, law firms, and we have representatives of these professions here. But the universe is much broader than that. There's the real estate companies, there's the art dealers, there's the notaries, and I think what we have now also seen with the sanctions that have been imposed, like following the invasion of Ukraine, also yacht sellers, casino owners. So it's a really, really broad range of professions which has this gatekeeping, I would say, opportunities, and has a role to fulfill in that space. And what we also see is that some of the gatekeepers, like banks, are super highly regulated, but others are almost not regulated. So it's a very diverse, universe of professions. We have also large firms, we have smaller firms. So I think there you can already see like where the challenges lie, because in every, let's say, money laundering scheme, you see always more than one gatekeeper involved. There's almost always a bank involved, but then also maybe a real estate firm, a law firm, what have you. So it's really very different professions. And what we have tried to do at the World Economic Forum is bringing these professions together and have a dialogue. Because I think a lot of the obligations at the moment are with banks maybe, but as we see, there are others with those obligations, and the regulation is often not in place, or it's dispersed, it's different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so we thought, we create like a value-based framework, and we called it like the unifying framework for gatekeepers. We did that also together with the World Bank, UNODC STAR initiative. I'm not sure if someone is in the room here as well, to basically, mobilize these different gatekeepers against practices, key practices, and key principles. And just to give you an overview of those. So obviously, this is not a surprising framework, but I think the special thing is really to have different gatekeepers from different professions, like really saying, okay, this is the direction in which we want to develop. We want to have clear policies, we want to have a culture of integrity, we want to have a speak-up culture, and we want to also collaborate across sectors and also across stakeholder groups. So this is what we have done so far, and I think very, very important for our work has been, as basic as it sounds, like really the awareness raising, because I think many gatekeepers, specifically from those that are not that regulated, are not really aware of the role they play. They are not really aware of that they are in a strategic position towards their clients and have a very important societal role actually to fulfill by impeding illicit financial flows. As I have not to tell anyone at this conference the consequences of illicit financial flows for often developing countries, the erosion of trust it means in societies and between politicians, between society and business sector. So so we have been creating this framework, and what we are currently doing is raising awareness, trying to establish more public-private collaboration around that topic, making sure that also gatekeepers are more in the loop, that their expertise is better harnessed when we develop solutions, because only then the solutions can be effective. And maybe one word on regulation, because often when we hear value-based framework, we think this is a substitute for regulation. It's definitely not, but we think it's an important way of complementing regulation, and regulation will only be efficient when we have like value-based framework, when we have the culture in place. I think we have heard that also several times over the panels that we had these days. And I stop here for now and come back later.
Can I ask one follow-up question? And we'll probably get into this a little bit more later in the conversation, but was there discussion about terminology, gatekeepers versus enablers versus, there's some different terminology being used depending upon where you sit?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, to be very clear, enabling is a criminal act. There's nothing good to say about it. But we believe that the term gatekeeper yeah, kind of represents a bit better the dual opportunity of those professions. You know, they obviously they can be in the enabling side of things, but they can also be like the gatekeepers and thereby impede illicit financial flows. And we really wanted to make sure that both sides are taken into account. And yeah, I think enabling is a reality. I mean, we have all seen the leaks, and we have seen the cases that have been in the media. But still, it's a fraction of gatekeeping professions, you know. And I think many of the gatekeepers, yes, they try to do the right thing. They try to help clients to actually comply with the law. So yeah, we just think it's a better start of a multi-stakeholder discussion.
Sure.
Also if we get the terminology not in a certain direction from the start.
And in terms of some of the gatekeepers, there are certain gatekeepers like accountants and lawyers and that sit within a regulatory kind of framework, depending upon the country perhaps, but certain other gatekeepers that are involved in the framework, like art dealers and real estate agents, were they also consulted as part of developing the unifying framework?
Yeah, they were consulted, but yeah, you can obviously see a difference between those that are regulated. They're much more aware of the responsibilities, and those that are not that regulated, they're also more difficult to approach and to get into these processes and into these dialogues. But I think we have to get there. We have to involve like really gatekeepers from really different professions, raise awareness about the role, and also look into the smaller gatekeepers, because there's lots of firms like, I don't know, the one man, one woman law firm or so, and these are much more difficult to reach because they are not organized in business associations such as the IFAC or the IBA. So this is still an open question for us. How can we make sure to also bring those smaller firms on board and make sure that they are aware of the gatekeeping function, aware of red flags, and so on.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Scott, maybe I'll hand it over to you. Here's
Sure,
the
clicker there.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Scott Hanson, and I'm from the International Federation of Accountants. There we go. Now, sort of speaking into this discussion about the regulatory perimeter, different levels of regulation, I want to start by talking about what the accountancy profession is, sort of in a defined way, how it's organized at the global level, how it functions, and that all will put who IFAC is in a bit of context. So what is a professional accountant? We consider that a defined term. Structurally speaking, it's an accountant that's a member of an IFAC member body. So IFAC is a member organization. We have 180 member bodies around the world in 130 different countries. We call those professional accountancy organizations, PAOs, accountancy institutes, the like. So those are the organizations that have as members professional accountants. In those 180 member bodies, there's roughly 3 million professional accountants around the world. To be an IFAC member organization, there's compliance and organizational requirements in terms of supporting the Global Code of Ethics, supporting global audit standards, education requirements, all of the type of association requirements to control quality of those members. So it's not simply a lobbying group or a member association, it's actually a compliance-driven quality system there. So things like the Global Ethics Code, professional standards, these are all set by independent standard-setting bodies that IFAC supports, and then those become part of the global infrastructure for professional accountants around the world. So that's where it gets interesting. All of those PAOs, all of those accounting institutes around the world, all look very, very different from one another. If you think about scope of membership, who's included, who has to be a member of those professional accounting organizations, that's where this regulation discussion becomes really complicated, really interesting, and that's why it's so relevant to the gatekeepers or enablers discussion. if you look across all of the different accountancy sort of constituencies or services, you have auditors, obviously the most regulated sort of service in the accounting universe, the audit, especially public interest entity auditors. You've got large firms, you have small firms, solo practitioners with all sorts of different specialties. You've got professional accountants in business, so CFOs, finance functions, so people working within business. You also have public sector. The public sector world in the accounting space is huge. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people around the world, every government around the world. So looking at those professional accountancy bodies, the number of them that are mandatory full service bodies, that is have required membership of all of those different constituencies, is extremely low. And that's where this regulatory gap perimeter issue comes in. Most professional accountancy organizations are either not mandatory or have limited scope of who they cover. If you look, for example, in French-speaking Africa, Francophone Africa, by law, the professional accountancy organization can only have auditors in it. So why is that important? The code of ethics, which we have a global code of ethics that applies all around the world, that's one of the key components of IFAC membership for our bodies. Self-regulatory functions, discipline, all of those things that the institutes do only apply to their members. And we've got a situation where that membership is relatively limited and looks very different around the world. So we're talking about two things here from our perspective. One is increasing the breadth and coverage of that self-regulatory and ethical perimeter, because right now it's relatively small. We cover 3 million professional accountants. We've probably got 2 or 3 times as many people around the world doing accountancy functions that are outside of this global professional infrastructure. So one is increasing the scope of that professional infrastructure, that self-regulatory and ethical perimeter. And then number 2, of course, is making sure that it works as well as possible, the infrastructure that we have. That's probably our single biggest challenge in this enablers discussion. But there's also a few other things I don't want to spend too much time in the opening remarks, but it goes without saying: beneficial ownership transparency. Accountants, lawyers, others in the gatekeeper professions, probably the single biggest users of that information. So not having access to that information is a severe hindrance in complying with these regulatory responsibilities. Whistleblowing protection legislation. Accountants in a system that works well should be probably one of the biggest sources of whistleblowing, because they're the people that are seeing the money move, see the accounts every day. We have an ethical standard in our global code of ethics that's a whistleblowing requirement. Without laws in place to make that ecosystem work, it falls flat and doesn't work. So these regulatory issues, beneficial ownership, whistleblowing protection, they all come together to sort of create this sort of structural landscape and challenges that we look to as we're entering sort of the discussion about enablers and versus gatekeepers here. I won't dwell on this, but I just think it's worthwhile putting these 2 slides up. These are from the FATF 4th round evaluation report that came out in May of this year. I want to highlight 2 things here. One, the dark blue line on the far right, that 9%. 9% of FATF member bodies and FSRBs, so 9% of the 206 countries around the world that have committed to implementing the FATF recommendations have effective beneficial ownership transparency. So 9% of 206. So I know beneficial ownership is a topic of discussion all over this event, but just to make it clear how low that number is around the world, and that's an impediment for us doing due diligence on clients, being able to be effective gatekeepers and helping to fight corruption. And then the other slide worth showing from the FATF report, this one's a little bit more complicated to read, but if you look at the middle bar in each section, the supervision of DNFPBs. So that's supervision of designated non-financial businesses, professions, accountants, lawyers, art dealers, casinos, other. Extremely low effectiveness ratings around the world on the supervision of the DNFPBs, of accountants and lawyers and casinos and others. And probably a lot of you think, well, that's what you guys want. You know, you want low levels of supervision. But actually, from our perspective, representing these PAOs, these accounting institutes, that's actually terrible news. It means that we don't have the legislative authority to effectively cover, survey, enforce money laundering requirements on the members of our members. So from our perspective, it's a structural gap that, again, you have 206 countries around the world that have agreed to implement this stuff, and it's just not happening. We want, of course, that all to be done well. We want to be stakeholders at the table, but it's just an important point to highlight there. So I'll stop my remarks. I probably spoke for way too long, but thank you very much.
No, no, not at all. I have one follow-up question right now, and you talk about the Code of Ethics and the rolling out of the Code of Ethics to all of the member organizations, and then that cascades down, right? And that's very important, absolutely. But what are some of the limitations that you've been seeing in terms of that?
Of course. Well, again, it starts off with that lack of coverage. We can only cover as many, accountants that are required to be in their institutes. But then when you look at smaller member organizations around the world, we have a lot of professional accountancy bodies that may be 3 or 4 volunteer members, and that's the entire body itself. So in terms of having expectations on them enforcing, having disciplinary procedures, enforcing a code of ethics, all those type of things, there's going to be challenges there. But again, the biggest single issue for us in terms of the code of ethics is in the enablers discussion or gatekeepers discussion in particular, there's a lot of developed countries, for example, where tax service providers aren't members, don't have to be members of professional accountancy bodies. The code of ethics doesn't work there. So we've got these type of structural limitations that prevent this from being a useful tool. A final point just on that I think is worth mentioning, connecting back to the ESG discussion. I don't know if anyone was in the room, this room prior to this. There is a lot more, there's a sort of tidal wave of ESG corporate reporting that's underway. It's coming, more and more companies are reporting every year. And there's growing expectations that all this ESG information that companies report be audited, be assured in some way. And unlike financial audit, there's a lot of different providers in this space. But not to get too technical for you, to do an audit correctly or pursuant to global audit standards, the auditor has to have a code of ethics equivalent to our code of ethics. And this is a structural aspect of doing an audit properly by the standards. So we've got engineering firms doing assurance on ESG information using the global audit standards that don't actually have a code of ethics that's comparable. And that's a huge gap in terms of, that we're facing as a big structural and sort of consumer protection or investor protection issue that's growing, is there's an ethics gap between auditors, traditional auditors, and new service providers doing ESG work. That's a totally different discussion, probably a better question for the previous panel, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, no. And maybe we'll go through, but maybe we can, during our discussion, Scott, also, because I can imagine the challenge that you have, IFAC has, given the breadth of the different member organizations, the different standards, expectations, obligations, depending upon the jurisdiction, like lawyers, which we'll talk about in a minute. But then, as you said, increasing the ethical infrastructure, and then make sure how it's working. And that's a huge, at least when I think about it. So maybe we can, in a minute, probe that a little bit, because I think that would be interesting to hear what you're doing there. So Sara, maybe we'll turn to you now and get your perspective as a lawyer in the IBA as that kind of constituency of gatekeeper.
Yes, I'll certainly do my best. I should probably eclipse this discussion by saying I'm not a corporate lawyer. I'm actually a criminal barrister of background who joined the IBA to take over the legal projects team, so I haven't ever practiced, and that's the disclaimer, so that everyone's aware I do speak with that limit. I'm interested to know the audience that I'm speaking to today. How many lawyers are in the room? Can I just see a show of hands? Oh, lots. Okay. Right. If that's a good or bad thing in the context of what I'm about to say, but I will certainly try and not say things that perhaps you're already overly familiar with. But I do think it's important for the benefit of the rest of us that we do understand certain things around core principles, which are so integral to the way the profession has to operate in order to essentially uphold the rule of law, which is the key phrase that everyone rolls out and perhaps not everybody understands, but is also a real obstacle in us achieving certain aims that perhaps people in this group might be wishing to see in terms of professional gatekeeping or professional enablement, curtailment. I'd like to start with something that Nicola Bonucci said to me yesterday, and as Tara said at the beginning, he was due to be here today, although we're delighted to have Tara. But I said, what would you say if you had to sort of sum up the content of this discussion? What would be your point that you'd like to get across? And he said, the legal profession is not as good as we should be, but not as bad as we are said to be. So I think in that context, we would use the expression that we think there are quite a lot more than a few bad apples, which is what some people say in response to these arguments, but we wouldn't say it's the whole barrel. Now, there may be some here who disagree with that, but I still would like to try to demonstrate that through the International Bar Association, we are at least beginning to have conversations about how we can improve the way our profession operates in recognition that it is clearly needed. So I think that's a positive starting point and one that we haven't seen before now. This is a real, believe me, this is a real advancement. And when you operate in an organisation as labyrinthine and difficult as the International Bar Association can be, that is a big step. So for those of you that don't know, I mean, I don't know if anyone, has anyone heard of the International Bar Association, or dare I say it is a member? Okay, there's a small number of you, that's good. Okay, well, it's a global membership for the legal profession. We have about 100,000 members, about 250 of the world's largest law firms, and 190 bars and law societies, which make up the vast majority of membership organisations in the world, spanning 170 countries. But whatever we do, whatever we produce is not mandated. It doesn't have any force. We can't enforce it. We're simply issuing best practice. We are capacity building. We are offering a network for people to come together and learn and show their expertise and meet other practitioners, but also to lobby and advance best practice across a whole wide range of legal areas. And that's part of what my team do by working on projects with international partners, such as the UN, the OECD, the World Bank, and others. So one of our key areas then is to try and build capacity, answer public concerns that arise with regard to the profession, and this is clearly one of them. It is important to remember, because this underlies everything, that lawyers are bound by principles that do take us into a different arena from many other professional service providers. And those are that we must be independent from external interference. We have to be fearless in our confidential representation of clients. We must disassociate from the identity or interests of clients. And this is important for the operation of a proper and fair legal profession, but whether this has been seen as wholly sufficient for the profession in the 21st century has come under intense scrutiny of late. And that scrutiny has come from both inside and outside the profession. Lawyers have been accused of hiding behind the principles in order to enable unpalatable financial activity and to further the ambitions of dangerous autocrats. And we've struggled as a profession, I believe, to come up with a coherent and unified response to these pressures. And what we see, and what is causing us real difficulty in coming up with a solution, are two ends of the spectrum within the profession. The ends of the spectrum that say we must defend the traditional principles at all costs, and by questioning them and by essentially asserting that there's a problem, we're undermining those principles that allow the profession to operate in an optimal sense. And the opposite end of the spectrum is we must reform, and we must introduce a new ethical and to some extent political dimension to our client relationships. And we see that emphasis coming through in the form of ESG, business and human rights, and also, although arguably less attractive, but certainly PR. So the representation of certain clients and the awkward issue this creates for law firms. See the mass exodus from Russia in light of the Ukraine war. See Kanye West being ditched by a law firm because he explains things and says things that are unpalatable to the vast majority of the population. But that goes against the principles. These things go against the basis upon which lawyers say they operate, which is we're not associated with the views of our client. Everyone deserves legal representation, and access to justice must be paramount. So what I'm not here today really to address is the issue of lawyers behaving corruptly in the sense of actively engaging in corruption, because we would say that sits in a criminal landscape. Those people have defied the principles, they should not be able to hide behind them, and there should be due process. Law enforcement action, prosecution, or disciplinary procedures must apply. Nor am I here to talk about the way that lawyers can represent clients in a standard criminal context. This is around corporate law. Corporate lawyers representing clients in this grey area, the ethical grey area where harms can arise to society, but it's not illegal. So it's been termed quite often lawful, but awful. So I think this is a blunt phrase, and I think what we've really tried to address in the IBA is how do we square some of our principles, and the IBA has tried to collate 10 core legal principles which have been agreed globally by our members. And the two that have, I think, quite core relevance for the purposes of today are principles 4 and 5. So principle 4 is an area we've done a lot of work on in the last couple of years, is this principle of lawyer-client confidentiality, which could be seen as an evil that creates a situation and a landscape in which clients can operate in a highly problematic way, and it hinders the ability of law enforcement to do their job properly, because we're hiding behind confidentiality as a basis for not revealing key material. Now, the IBA has produced a document on lawyer-client confidentiality through my team, but through our work with members earlier this year. So this year we've published that, it's available on our website, and it tries to show why we need confidentiality in layman's terms. Why does it matter? Why should we defend it? And why is it critical? Subject to, of course, the constraints applied by law where circumstances require it to be lessened or removed altogether if it's been misused. So that is, I mean, I'm trying to think, sorry, I'm conscious of time here, but I know this is an important aspect which all of you have got in mind when thinking about the role of lawyers and how this can be misused. I think the second point that's worth referencing, which I find the most pertinent, is the one I've already alluded to, which is the client interest. So this question in principle 5 is where the grey area of the lawyer-client relationship is of greatest resonance. Now, what we've been finding in our work here is that different codes of conduct in different jurisdictions suggest different outcomes. So it's quite a patchwork landscape. You've got the Solicitors Regulation Authority in England and Wales that says that if there's a conflict between what the client wants and the public interest, then the public interest must prevail. Where the public interest is defined is anybody's guess, but it is the position that there is a public interest top trump card. In other jurisdictions, and we've been trying to look through, we've had a questionnaire at around 40 different jurisdictions, nothing is said, or it's clear that the client interests come first, no matter what, obviously subject to the issues around legality, or the administration of justice, or the court. So you've got this wide range of different ethical codes. And what I think is the most challenging is law firms that operate in multiple countries where their own lawyers are trying to operate with different ethical codes of conduct, and then what does the law firm put in place in terms of its governance structure and its own policy? And this is a conversation we've been having with Delia Piper, who've been helping us do this research. So we've got this challenge to our work. And what we're currently trying to see is whether through our own modification of our commentary to the international codes of conduct and also to our business and human rights practical guidance, which very much draws on the UN guiding principles and the work that business has been doing to try and up its game and improve its output. We are trying to see if we can amend those, modernize them, and make them fit for purpose in today's society, taking into account the principles, not trying to damage them, but also taking into account what civil society wants and expects. So it's a real challenge. We're trying to go beyond the standard concept of legal ethics, the core value trinity of neutrality, i.e. not the lawyer to be the judge of the client, partisanship, which is the lawyer should do everything they can to achieve the client's objectives, and non-accountability, which is where the lawyer is not responsible for the client's decisions. So what we say here is that actually we must go beyond that standard. That's narrow justice, that's narrow construct, and we need to see a much wider and a much more morally sound approach being taken. I'm going to stop there. I could go on forever. This project is enormous, and it's the most challenging thing I think I've ever done, intellectually and practically speaking. But if anyone wants to get involved or speak to me about it afterwards, please do, because we have an enormous task force of academics, judges, practitioners, and different consultants from all over the world who are trying to come up with some real steps that will make a tangible difference to the profession.
That's very interesting, Sarah. And so I was taking it down. Now you're focusing on how you can take into account what civil society wants in setting the principles for the profession. Is that right?
Well, I think what we're trying to recognise is the pressure that's being put on us by civil society through different constructs. So ESG is a good example of that, business and human rights, the evolving of soft law into hard law, which we are seeing definitely in the prism of business and human rights, and working out what does that mean in terms of the role of the lawyer? What is the purpose of the lawyer? The lawyer is not just a blind machine that is there to facilitate any client's desires.
Right.
Obviously not. You know, we're trying to really go beyond that. As I mentioned, the standard concept of only do what's legal in the black letter of the law. Become a wise counsellor is some of the language that we're seeing. So what does that mean in terms of behaviour? And is it only going to be a question of regulation and hard stick that will actually lead us to that better place, if you like? Do we need something, you know, we're looking at things like the global accountants position in terms of the global ethics standard. Is that feasible for the legal profession? Possibly not, but this is at one end of the spectrum of different ideas. So we have to put everything on the table and see where we get to. And the conversation is the first part. The two documents I've mentioned being addressed and amended is the second part. Typologies of what different law firms are doing to show brilliant practice or at least better practice. All of these things can start feeding into an overall set of materials that will help. But to actually see change, do we need to influence the regulators or others?
Well, yeah, the ethical rules that govern lawyers in the United States versus the UK or
precisely.
some other
It's
country.
problematic.
It's a challenge, a real challenge. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Delia, can I turn to you now and get your thoughts on the role of gatekeepers in the illicit financial flows, your work, and kind of where you see some of the opportunities for addressing the challenges and then the challenges?
Thank you very much. I would say what civil society wants, and we have already been talking about that. So very simply, at this point of the day, if we are going to fight corruption, fight illicit money flows or stop illicit money flows, work against money laundering. If these are the objectives, and we need to stop that if we want to stop corruption or prevent corruption or solve the problem we are working, we have to break the cycle of corruption, which I call the she cycle, not connotation on gender. The S go for to steal, the H for to hide, and the E to enjoy. And that's the cycle of corruption. The money that's stolen in Africa or in Latin America ends, this money stolen from the national budgets or the money who is lost to corruption in those countries, ends in the city of London, the luxury industry in Paris, the art market in Geneva, the real estate industry in New York or Canada. And this is the cycle. The money is stolen, then it is hid, and then it is enjoyed by the corrupt guys. And in all this cycle, we have different professionals working. Of course, we cannot approach this problem saying all bankers are criminals, all lawyers are bad persons, all accountants are a disaster. No. But we have to really recognize that we have a problem, because in these cycles, there are many professionals helping to steal the money, think about public procurement and the regulation of public procurement and how to hide the real owner of a company bidding in a public procurement deal in order to hide a conflict of interest, for instance, or things like that, facilitating the stealing part of the cycle. And then we have to hide the money because the money cannot be publicly shown. So then we have accountants, bankers, lawyers, corporate lawyers creating very complex structures in order to hide the real owner of the company. And then we have those who provide without asking where the big bags with money, where are they coming from, and they are providing the real estate, great properties in London or the apartments in New York, or the cars in Paris, or the art in Geneva or other markets. So how are we going to deal with the bad guys, taking Sullivan's initial speech yesterday? How are we going to deal with those facilitating corruption in this cycle, helping to steal, to hide, and to enjoy? Of course, it is not only lawyers and accountants. We have other professions too. And the professions that are involved are not, as Katja mentioned, they are not identically regulated around the world. They are not identically organized around the world, and we have heard the examples from the accountants and from the lawyers. So regulating is one solution, but it will take a complicated set of rules and enforcement agencies to cover all the professions in one law. And there are, talking about the regulation, there are many regulations regarding, for instance, the banking system. And the banking system has been part of the enablers problem. No matter how many rules, laws, supervision authorities they have been part of the problem. So regulation is not a magic thing. It can help, but it depends on the context, the local or national regulation context, and it depends also on the type of profession we are going to try to tackle. That's number one. Then we have self-regulation. And in that sense, of course, the work that the professional associations are doing, not for this topic, but forever, since I have a memory, the lawyers have had associations or bars. You have to register, certificate yourself in order to act. There are controls or accountability within the profession, the same with other professions. So one thing is the self-regulation from the association and the unifying framework that the Global Future Council from the WEF created and Katja presented, sets some standards that can be applied for those associations in order to organize the set of rules the associations wants to put in place. And this self-regulation from the professional should include some sanctions, of course. For
Some
wrongdoing.
sanctions?
For wrongdoing, of course. If not, it's just declarations of good faith. And we have another thing, which is the self-regulation in terms of self-commitment. And this brings us to the discussion we were having in the previous panel on ESG and ethics. Because many lawyers, I am a lawyer, in order to disclose this at the very beginning. Lawyers know, in many cases, that it is something strange around this case. And you can take it or not. And of course, one argument, at least in my region from lawyers, is everybody has right to have a lawyer to defend their cases. But you as a lawyer can say, no, I'm not going to defend this case because there is something strange. Or I'm not going to create this complicated set of corporate structures and register in Montevideo or Panama, et cetera, because I know, although I cannot ask or have not asked the client, I know what these structures are used to. So I think there is an ethical thing there that we as professionals, when we act as professionals, has to take into account. But what we are asking from civil society is that those involved in this facilitation, those who are really enablers instead of gatekeepers, suffer the consequences of their conduct. If they help to steal, to hide, or to enjoy, they have to be responsible. Not only the legal entity you are part from, which can recover very easily the money they lost in terms of fines or some sanctions, but you personally, because in anti-corruption, there is a last barrier, always, which is a person with integrity, which says no. So the person involved should also suffer the consequences for a lawful but awful deed. But before ending, Tara, I know I am running out of time. The gatekeepers and the enablers are not only the professionals, the ones we have here and the ones we have mentioned. We have enablers that are legislators. We have enablers that are agencies, anti-corruption agencies, anti-money laundering agencies that are enablers in many countries. We have also the judiciary as enabler. And we have had 2 weeks ago the decision by the European Court on Beneficial Ownership Transparency. And I said to the press that day, in one day, the European Court has destroyed years of work from civil society to get the information about beneficial ownership. And I don't say that the court has acted in bad faith or that the decision is not grounded in the legal argumentation. What I am saying is that that decision is enabling money laundering, corruption, and illicit financial flows. And finally, the access to information, the accessibility of information for the gatekeepers, the profession, is essential. We cannot charge gatekeepers, the professionals, to get absolutely a good picture of the network of corporate structures behind suspicious pattern if we don't allow them to access information. And for instance, this decision on the court, which has closed the public accessibility to the registers, is against what we try to ask from the professionals. Because many professionals can go to the registers and get the information. But if we close the information and there is no possible way in which we can oblige or mandate them to get the information, it is unfair. And that's something that is happening because a professional can resort to this no that I say, but if not, if it is not sure or if he wants to do some investigation, we cannot ask an accountant or a lawyer to analyze during 2 or 3 years the whole complex structure of ownership of one kleptocrat. in order to decide whether he will or not take the case, will or not write the contract, etc.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yep, no, thank you. I believe, but we all should check, that yesterday they issued a clarification, right, and that decision saying
Yeah.
civil society and journalists could access the
Yeah, the
information, right?
clarification is another trampa. How do you say trampa?
Trumps the,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's-
which
it's
we
try-
we
it's
really
trying to-
prefer not
yeah,
using
it's
that
trying
as a
to
verb anymore, but,
yeah,
you
it's
know.
trying to, the clarification is trying to stop civil society for complaining and organizing action against the decision. Why? Because in the decision itself, during the argumentation, or in the part of the argument, it says, no problem with civil society organization. It is clear, and it's part of the argumentation, it is clear that civil society organization and journalists have a legitimate interest. Those of you who are lawyers know very well that legitimate interest is a great barrier
Yeah.
if you want to access something. And this is not in the decision, and you cannot change the decision itself. It is in the argumentation. So what I said in one of the meetings immediately after the resolution with the chapters of Transparency International is, don't be happy with that line, because some people were saying, yeah, but stay calm, keep calm, that civil society organization and journalists are protected. And I say, sorry, as a lawyer, I would say, I would not stay calm.
It's not in the
because it's not the
in the
decision.
If I can just
Yep.
jump in very briefly on, not to go down too much of a beneficial ownership rabbit hole, which was quite easy to do. But in terms of sort of the most famous public registry, obviously the United Kingdom beneficial ownership registry, the accounting bodies in the UK advise accountants there in the anti-money laundering compliance guidance that you can't rely on the information in the beneficial ownership registry. It's not good enough to be actionable information. At the same time, law enforcement in the United Kingdom can't, isn't able to rely on it for sort of actual law enforcement purposes. So we've got, it gets even worse, and that's when people are actually trying to break the law, you get bad information in those registries, public, non-public, that's an issue there. So how do you deal with that issue? It becomes, so, we don't have a position on the public aspect. We want the information for our constituency, obviously, but the real issue for us is how do you get good information? Because even when it's public in the most famous case, it's not actionably quality, it's not of actionable quality. And what do you do? What's the way forward there?
Of course, that register have companies owned by Donald Duck.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No sense to have a public register saying that Donald Duck is the owner of the company, or people under not 30, as I asked in the opening session, people under 2 years old owning 400 companies registered under the name of a 2-year baby. Okay.
I'm going to ask one follow-up question on that, and then open it up for questions from the audience. Just in terms of your focus, Delia, on self-regulation, right? The self-regulation and the unifying framework kind of feeds into that, and then organizations, professional organizations, then have this obligation to investigate and to sanction for any violations. So Sara, as one of those professional associations, what is your kind of reaction to that? Yes, because that then puts those professional organizations in a policing function, right? In terms of conducting investigations, you take a complaint, an allegation, you investigate, you sanction. I'm just thinking the practical application of Delia's recommendation.
So, sorry, forgive me, is the question in relation to how far should we be going? Then?
Well, yes,
Especially if we were to take that quite
right. If you were
literally.
to take that recommendation literally.
In many bar associations in Argentina and other Latin American countries, we register, but there are bodies within the bar that take
have
care of
ethical-
our ethical conduct. So if a client presents a complaint, against a lawyer because
Right.
he has spread information, whatever it is,
Right.
we can get sanctioned.
We have that here
Even
too, right.
deprive of the certification to keep on working as lawyers. Even that.
So we have that too.
Yeah.
But I just didn't, it sounded like it was a little bit beyond that in terms of setting up the infrastructure, which kind of goes in also, Scott, to what you were saying for the accounting profession, right?
Yeah, just a brief comment there. So when I showed up the slide for implementation of FATF 28, which is the supervision of DNFPB, supervision of the professions. And that standard gives you two options, gives governments two options. You can either regulate the professions for AML with a regulator, a regulatory agency, or through a self-regulatory professional body, which is, gives you good flexibility there. But when you think about it a little more deeply, the countries where you've got the resources to have a good regulator are also the same countries where you have a good resources to have a professional body that can do the work itself. So
Yeah.
United States, Canada, Australia, it's, if they have the resources to have a regulator, the professional body is probably resourced enough too. Then you go to the other end of the development spectrum. I mentioned, in a lot of the developing world, we have professional bodies that are made up of 3 volunteers that have full-time jobs. So those are the exact same countries where you have no resources to have a statutory regulator that performs those AML functions. So it's,
Yeah.
obviously we're talking about enablers in the sort of the developed world, the London, the Geneva, New York sense. But in terms of the stealing, the first stage, it's a resource issue to a large degree.
It's certainly true of the legal profession, and I think the real argument that we have put back at us when we've been speaking with our members, corporate lawyers and the like, is we have finite resources. How far do you expect us
Right.
to go? What is the actual reasonable limit to which we can determine the know your client or the due diligence approach before which our potential obligations are exhausted, or what is the definition of that? Can we have guidance? And this is where we're really struggling, because clearly,
Sure.
How long's a piece of string in terms of how much you can do and what's reasonable to expect? Some of these law firms are obviously extremely wealthy, so you'd expect them to do perhaps a bit more than they already are in some cases. I think that's fair to say. But I think there has to be a reasonable and proportionate limit placed on that. Otherwise, work becomes impossible.
Yep. Did I see a question? Yes, sir. And then we'll go around. Yep, go ahead, sir. Oh, there is, do you want this mic?
Hi, thanks. Once again, James Cohen from TI Canada. I'm sorry, I have to interject on the statement about the UK Beneficial Ownership Registry. It is well known that that registry has flaws, and it was because civil society had access to that registry. It was Global Witness who first flagged, here are all the flaws in the registry. So the idea, and I've heard this from Canadian bankers as well, who just go to the UK registry, and anybody from Companies House, please reform it, because everyone seems to be just using this as a scapegoat for, well, let's not do it because the UK registry didn't work. It's got to be seen that there's reform going on. Everybody knows that data verification is required. There's hearings going on in UK Parliament right now about how to do data verification. So I truly hope that the accounting bodies of the world aren't saying there's the UK registry, it's not great, therefore beneficial ownership, transparency, we're not so sure. Because I have heard that from Canadian bankers, and it's a false argument. It's a red herring. And it should be quashed.
And to be clear, absolutely not. That's not the point there. It's the point I was trying to advance is, from our perspective, the more important issue is accuracy and quality of the data. And if public is a means to that end, then that's fine. But our focus is first and foremost on needing actionable information. So that's the point I was trying to make. It wasn't a position against public, like, we tried public once, it didn't work there, so we're done. That's
Right.
obviously, that's not the point there. So.
I think there's a question here, and then we'll go over here. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Frank Vogel. I happen to have written a book this year called The Enablers, and we'll talk about it on Friday afternoon at the panel with other authors. Let me just ask a question about lawyers. I heard everything you said, and I'm puzzled why the American Bar Association has repeatedly been against money laundering legislation in the US Congress. It's not just a question of bad apples. It's a question that we who have tried so hard in civil society in so many countries to get basic minimum laws against money laundering, against corruption, have repeatedly come up against associations of lawyers who have opposed it. The amount of money that has been repatriated, that has been stolen from people around the world, the amount of money repatriated is minimal, absolutely minimal, because lawyers and their clients and the bankers have colluded to prevent the repatriation of that money. When you talk about, sorry, just one more thing.
Sure.
When you talk about accountants, it's not just a question of poor countries or badly regulated. Read the Zondo Commission in South Africa. They had regulations, they have had the justice ability, and the accounting companies involved come out absolutely terribly. Look at the Wirecard fraud in Germany, a major developed country, and look at the culpability of the accounting companies. So don't you think, as lawyers and accountants, it's time that you stop just giving us the general commentary about good ethics, which we've heard for as long as I can possibly remember, and actually stood up and said, these are the laws we need, we will campaign, we will lobby for these laws. And then, just to answer the question, what are the laws that are the ones against corruption and money laundering that you, both your associations, put at the top of your list? Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
No, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the ABA, and clearly we have 190 bars and law associations.
yeah.
Sorry, because it's not working. I don't know why.
Try that.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yep, there you go.
No, as I say, I am not here to speak on behalf of the ABA because we have a completely inconsistent position. This is another example of how having a global legal profession is in itself somewhat of an anomaly, because I mentioned the codes of conduct and the huge variance in where the primary duty lies, and that's in itself a nightmare when it comes to then trying to agree solutions that get global endorsement from our members. But certainly in the UK and within the European Union, the laws are very much aligned with what's in the Enablers Act. So it's curious to me that the ABA is taking that position, speaking from a personal perspective. But I can't defend it. I can't suggest here today why they should be taking that view. They place it in terms of lawyer-client confidentiality and their concern to protect the principle. I'm not defending that. I'm just saying that what I've understood. But we certainly at the IBA do not stand behind that and say, right, we believe the ABA is taking the right course. We allow each bar association to take its own response in the domestic context to suggested and proposed legislation. But there is a curiosity there because it's working perfectly well, arguably, in other jurisdictions, and yet the US would say it undermines a fundamental principle of the legal profession, which doesn't add up if you compare to what we're saying in the UK and the EU would work. So that's my answer to that point. I don't know, Scott, did you want to answer something in relation
For the
to
accountancy?
Sure. We have it a little bit easier on our side because it's much more of a hierarchical, globally structured profession. We have the IFAC infrastructure and global standards that we implement. In terms of answer the question, IFAC has a strong public opinion on supporting the implementation of the FATF framework. I mean, in terms of, it's very clear, you can find it on our website, we support implementation of the FATF framework in all 206 countries around the world that have agreed. I mean, that's a good foundational piece. When you talk about gatekeepers, enablers, the intersection with the accountancy profession is going to be primarily through money laundering. So attacking it at that front is where we start. In terms of specific laws, I mean, we're talking, as I showed there, it's FATF 24, FATF 25, FATF 28. Those are the big ones that are going to make a significant difference to make this all function better. I mentioned also the whistleblowing provision, sort of the gap in the whistleblowing framework and whistleblowing legislation. I know that Canadian friends, we've got a new review, I believe, in Canada that was just announced on the whistleblowing situation there. That's something that we're actually likely to be speaking into in a few months. But just as a little anecdote, being an IFAC member organization, those 180 member organizations, requires a commitment to advance the code of ethics and implement the global code of ethics. We've got 55% of the countries around the world have fully implemented, including our whistleblowing provision. We've got 40% that have partially implemented, And those are primarily countries that haven't been able to implement the whistleblowing provision, and then a small group that hasn't implemented, and this for a variety of reasons. The reason we have 40% of the countries around the world that haven't fully implemented the Code of Ethics is because they don't have a legal foundation to require this whistleblowing provision. They don't have a legal provision to enable accountants to breach the confidentiality requirement, which is what our whistleblowing obligation effectively does. So 40% of the countries around the world, we need a legislative situation that allows for whistleblowing and allows the breach of confidentiality to use the no-car provision as the Code of Ethics. But go back to the main point there, it's FAT of 24, 25, and 28 are the key pieces of legal infrastructure that we need.
Thank you. You had a question, ma'am? And then, sir, I'm going to go to you right after her. Sorry. Can you just wait for the microphone? Sorry. He's coming to you.
My name is Juliet Ibeka-Kumwago, and I'm an advisor to the government of Nigeria on anti-money laundering and anti-bribery issues. I worked previously with the FATA regional body in West Africa, and currently working closely with the Commonwealth Lawyers Association on issues related to gatekeepers and how we deal with the legal profession. I'm a lawyer, by the way. And I think the lessons we have learned, I think from where I come from, is that it's been quite tough dealing with or enforcing the FATA principles, the issue of disclosures amongst lawyers in particular. And the thing is that even within the FATF recommendations, it provides for exceptions. And that means that when you talk about the issues related to confidentiality issues, the extent to which you can protect your client's confidentiality, then it becomes a very, very difficult issue to deal with globally. And then the question then is, how do we manage the exceptions? Meaning, when you are dealing with trusts and you are dealing with criminal money, funds that are traveling and crossing borders, and we know that something is wrong. And I think in terms of the self-regulatory framework, the problem, as Delia pointed out, is how do we enforce that? How do we make sure that even when people cross the line, that you can enforce it? And I think that is what maybe IBA needs to be looking at. The sanctions and the enforcement measures do not exist. So even if we do agree that there's something wrong, we're going to put in self-regulatory measures, how do we sanction? I don't think that any bar body is able to sanction and enforce. Maybe the UK self-regulatory framework is working well. It's not working at all in Africa. And I think this is the challenge that we all need to grapple with. How do we enforce when it exists? The only way we've managed to do so maybe when we come through the anti-money laundering framework, and then we begin to use the law enforcement systems to enforce and make people turn around and maybe respond to the kind of things that Virgil talked about, is we're no longer talking about profession here. We're talking about what is wrong and what is right, and whether we should allow it to continue. Thank you.
Thank you. And that dovetails, that also dovetails with a question that came from one of the virtual folks who are participating remotely on the self-regulation. In order to be effective, yes, sanctions, but what else will be included? You're talking about auditing, you're talking about monitoring, you're talking about, which that's a huge infrastructure to contemplate, but any reactions to those comments? And
I mean, I certainly think that self-regulation is something that must be preserved. I do believe in that. I think that that's an important thing. If you hand regulation back to governments, therein lies all manner of difficulties. And so in order to retain the principle of independence, I think it is self-regulation must remain. However, it does not have sufficient teeth. Its ability to be truly useful is varied depending on the jurisdiction and the resources available. And there have to be consequences. What will motivate lawyers and law firms to do something differently? Well, we've seen some examples in relation to what's the PR consequence of retaining that piece of work or continuing to act in that situation. So a client-driven responses are a key thing. If a client demands change, if a client says, right, well, are you advising in accordance with ESG issues? Or how do you stand? Is there a ranking that we can delineate here for law firms where then you only choose law firms that seem to be scoring highly? You know, there's a whole raft of possibilities that you could do that will create the impetus for law firms and lawyers to behave differently in the corporate context. But then you get into the high street lawyers, the individual practitioners, and there's a whole different set of incentives there as well. But again, maintaining your client base and your financial flow, if I can put it that way, as a practitioner, as a business, is key. So it's a number of things here. It's reputational, it's client-driven, it's better self-regulation with actual teeth, and consequences. There need to be consequences. Delia mentioned that earlier. You know, it's not... Well, look what happened with the Pandora Papers. So the Pandora Papers highlighted behavior of law firms that fell into that grey area. It wasn't illegal, but it was seen as problematic. So you had investigative journalists bravely reporting on what was going on in areas where lawyers had operated within the realms of law, but distastefully. And no doubt that's led to a serious reconsideration of how that law firm is going to operate. So it's almost public exposure, and I come back to the PR question. What's the regulatory position there? I'm not sure at the moment. But you know, the infrastructure, as Tara mentioned, in order to make this work globally is enormous.
Yep.
And that's the challenge we at the IBA face in trying to make that recommendation.
Great,
And if
thank
you
you.
allow me, Tara, one thing.
Oh, yes, sorry.
This can be solved only with collective action. So I am very grateful for the whole panel and for accepting to work with Transparency International and discuss these topics. We have done so under the umbrella of the World Economic Forum and the Global Future Council. But here we are in another, with another setting that is civil society asking for some changes, some impact. But the only way we can work is like this, talking, explaining what are the possibilities, and creating, as we created the unifying framework, which is not the solution for the problem, but it is one step, and we gather with the art dealers, we gather with the industry of the real estate in New York, and we heard what were the problems they were facing and how can we regulate, because these two professions are not so regulated as bankers, but they are regulated in many countries. Think about the art market, and we have an excellent colleague here who has helped us. Think about the real estate profession in countries where there are not even land or property registers as mandatory, and the transaction is done in an office, and that's
Right.
it.
Yeah.
So we have a big problem here. We will solve it only if we work together, asking what we want to get and hearing what we can get, but with the support of the professions, saying we are here with the civil society organization, trying to get the right legislation or the right sanctions, the right supervision in order to solve the problem.
Yep. And this gentleman back here has been very patient. Thank you. Do you have a mic? There you go.
Thank you. I'm Alan Labour from Canada. First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for such a wonderful presentation and for energizing us at 6:30 at night with the topic. I'm a little embarrassed to follow such two profound questions and meaningful questions with my rather simple questions. I actually had three, but one of them was asked previously and very well posed. But the other two questions are, the first is quite simple. To the lawyers, when you talk about public interest, there is an increasing tendency for lawyers to operate slap suits, which prevent the public interest and prevent civic society from actually accessing the information. And does your association, how does that fit into the ethical standards of that? That's the first question. The second question I ask would be for both the accountancy and the lawyers. FATF has a gray list and a black list as they go through that. As you go through your professional associations, do you create a similar sort of hierarchy, and do you link it with the FATF lists so that you provide a risk register that would be linked to FATF as well, which would provide a better indication for the intermediaries to assess the quality of professionals in other countries in providing information or securing information? Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I'll take the first of those questions in relation to SLAPS. And SLAPS, when I refer to the sort of ethical conundrum that lawyers have faced, not just recently, but over a number of years, I cover in current terms issues around climate, so lawyers advising clients in the context of climate and environmental impact. I would cover the use of NDAs, so the non-disclosure agreements and how they can be egregiously misused in order to facilitate problematic outcomes for victims or complainants. And I would also include SLAPS. And SLAPS are an area that have been approached differently in different jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions are quite advanced in how they've responded to these issues, and I know the US is more advanced, and the EU, in fact, compared with the UK. And in fact, there was an anti-SLAP conference only last week I attended part of in relation to the UK proposal on a model law, which will try to at least stop some of the more egregious cases of SLAP use, and put in place there's a proposed put in place for a statutory mechanism for the judge to stop them much, much earlier when it's recognised that they are being used as an abusive process. And secondly, to limit costs, which are one of the biggest problems for journalists and often people who are being faced with these issues, because they run up into £1 million or more pounds or dollars, which is a significant outlay. I think there was also reference yesterday, I was interested to hear what Samantha Power said about the insurance position, which is a really interesting development in this space. And one that's long overdue, because individuals, freelance people are obviously the most vulnerable. So SLAPS is within no doubt at all under this ethical umbrella that we're looking at, but there are different components in terms of what you can do. It is indefinitely within that, yeah.
And maybe I'll jump on the second question there. So the quick answer is no. We don't do that at the IFAC level in terms of creating a gray list. But to make that answer a little more detailed, obviously we would refer everyone to their local financial intelligence unit to sort of get the intelligence of what's going on in different countries. And I'm sure many of our larger members provide that type of intelligence to their members. So I imagine that exists. But at the IFAC level, I mentioned that it's a compliance-based membership. So our 180 member organizations have committed to implementing the global standards for ethics, for audit, et cetera. And if they don't meaningfully follow those obligations, there's a risk that they would be kicked out. I mean, that is a possibility there. So in terms of sort of a professional accounting body falling out of IFAC membership, that's a real possibility. At the same time, there's a large number of countries that aren't IFAC members for various governance or reasons. You can look at our website on one of the first pages to see the map of which countries aren't IFAC members, and that gives you a sense as to where the accounting bodies aren't fully developed in terms of standards for ethics and education, et cetera. But I think an interesting point on that FATF gray list issue is that when you look at countries that have received bad marks, that have gone on the gray list or black list, there have two come to mind: Cayman and Barbados. They had terrible FATF results. They got a bad reputation, probably deservedly, and they changed, and they sort of had that as a realization moment. And anti-money laundering education is now annual requirements in both of those countries for accountants, whereas prior to it wasn't part of the curriculum at all. So there's actual positive changes from enforcement. So I think that's actually a useful lesson in terms of when you enforce things, that there are actual results. I think Frank, you mentioned the Wirecard scandal. Obviously, makes a lot of people look bad and something that they're not proud of the profession. But there's radical structural changes at that firm that are happening largely on foot of that situation. So, bad news has impacts, and that happens at the professional accounting body level, at the firm level. So I think there's something to be said for strong and vigorous enforcement, because it makes us better in the end.
Thank you. We're going to go here, here, and here, and then we're going to end it. So,
Yeah.
sir?
Thank you very much. AJ Brown from Transparency International Australia, and also one of Delia's team on the International Board of TI. Sorry to keep you in the hot seat there, Sarah, but my question is to you. I've got two. I'll save one for afterwards. I'll ask you privately, but the first question that I wanted to ask you really goes to your project and your strategy in terms of relying on PR and reputation as a motivator for a shift in ground, or one of them. And I guess I just wanted to push you on that a little bit further, because there's no question that there are many national legal bodies that are for whom their position does not add up, as you very diplomatically, I think, accomplished a very good answer to Frank on that. Certainly it doesn't add up. And Australia's Law Council position, similarly to the ABA, does not add up. It's similarly recalcitrant. And I guess in terms of the things that might shift that, I guess I just wanted to challenge that focus on reputation, because what we've certainly noticed in Australia is that when we're dealing with different professions, there are very different levels of pushback, resistance, recalcitrance. And one of the things that I think is most surprising us at the moment, that the real estate industry is actually more likely to be positive, and more likely to be susceptible, even though there's probably a higher proportion of really bad apples. There's a higher degree of sensitivity, partly, especially on that reputation issue, I think, because in real estate, it's much easier to go, right, well, we just don't want any bad publicity associated with our firm, therefore we are actually going to comply and support this. And for example, in Australia, we have real estate companies called things like Integrity Real Estate. We don't have any law firms called Integrity Legal. And I guess I just wanted to push you on that a little bit, because I think the legal profession is quite capable of resisting bad media. It's over the decades and the generations, the legal profession, especially law firms, are quite capable of resisting bad media. They've been mired in bad reputation for forever, and they will continue to be, and they will continue to rely on the fact that people need lawyers. Yeah. So I guess I've got another question I'll ask you afterwards, but I guess that was the first one.
Let's just address that one, then we'll go to this gentleman, those two, because we're going to run out of time. So can you respond to that, Sarah?
Very quickly, I'll try, and perhaps we can have a separate conversation, because it's certainly not a standalone point. I mean, I completely agree with you, and you're right to push back on it. It is simply something that we have observed, very much so in the last year, where you've seen law firms. Why did they remove themselves from Russia? I mean, obviously there's a moral opprobrium for what's going on, but there's also a PR concern. There's a sort of domino effect. Why are law firms choosing not to represent some people? Why law firms want to be seen by clients as doing the right thing, increasingly so, as far as we can tell, from the bigger, more corporate body law firms. But it is only one element, because at the bottom of it all, which I feel, and I only say this in my very personal view as a non-corporate lawyer, greed still prevails. So the desire to make a lot of money, the desire to have significant profits, the desire to be one of the top performing law firms is still a significant feature. So how do you balance out these different considerations? PR is one aspect of that, but certainly not the sole answer.
All right, this gentleman here, and then we're going to go to the gentleman in the back. And then Katja's going to wrap us all up.
Hello, and I appreciate the fact that you're, again, so late and doing so much with, and everyone that's here attending, congratulations. My name is Mike Lockname. I'm currently involved, my main work is training financial investigation techniques to law enforcement, okay, at all levels, and I do it internationally. By the way, you have SHE as your acronym? I use 3 N's. Lying, cheating, stealing. Just as a thought. Real simple question. The term professional always troubles me. It's something to hide behind, quite frankly. When I would do fraud investigations, whether it was the company president, they went to jail. If it was the treasurer, they went to jail. And the investigation was done by the government. They received information from the professions that indicate something was going on. In the financial records, we have suspicious transaction reports. Why isn't that kind of connection being made? Because sanctions, fine, someone gets to sit on their butt for a few months. They should be in jail. When I teach investigators, I teach them, find those gatekeepers and wring them dry.
Yeah,
Because
well,
they know where the keys to everything are. And they'll lead me through my network, and they'll show me where everything is.
Right, and the DOJ in the US, right, they really focus on gatekeepers when
It's
they're
the
looking
key.
at fraud,
They're
right?
they're the experts.
Right,
So, I'm sorry, I don't accept professional.
right. Okay, and this gentleman in the back right here, who's been standing the whole time, so he gets even more kudos.
Appreciate it, y'all. I'm Scott Graytech with the Transparency International U.S. office. To our friend from the IBA, I'm really grateful, sincerely, that you're here and having this conversation with this crowd. So I'm sure you heard yesterday that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, on behalf of the Biden administration, said that they give their full support to the Enablers Act that the U.S. Congress has been considering. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Passed by the House of Representatives this summer. Biden administration has supported it. It's now being considered right now in the Senate. Literally this week is a critical week about whether it will be passed into law. I'm an attorney. We need courageous voices coming from legal associations. Can you say, on behalf of the IBA or even in your personal capacity, that you support the reforms that the Enablers Act would accomplish? Thank you.
Pass. I can't, that's a very mealy-mouthed response, I know. But I mean, how it's a very difficult position to put me here in. You know, this is not entirely Chatham House. And what I have said is what I stand by, which is that it works in the UK, it works in other jurisdictions. We're all supposedly a global legal profession, and yet the position varies from country to country. But as far as I'm aware, I'm a former prosecutor myself. I worked for 20 years for government. It works in the UK to a point. It's not the panacea, but I don't understand the outrage that the ABA have put forward, quite frankly. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, with that, all right, well done, Sarah. All right, so we only have 2 more minutes. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a big, huge column right in front of me, so I
Understood.
apologize. I didn't see you.
No, thanks so much. And my name's Sasha Caldera. I'm from Publish What You Pay Canada, and this question is actually kind of a follow-up to Scott's. So in the case at Canada v. FLSC 2015, the Justice Cromwell ruled that Parliament can carry out an inspection regime in a constitutionally compliant manner. And I'm wondering if the IBA would be supportive of Canada's Parliament carrying out a study on whether or not solicitor-client privilege could be tweaked in a constitutionally compliant manner as per the ruling, and if the IBA would also instruct the Canadian Bar Association and the FLSC to support such an initiative.
I think there may be some level of misunderstanding about the role of the IBA. We don't tend to tell bars or instruct anyone on what to do. We create guidance for our members that's based on a wholesale agreement on high-level points, or we create specific guidance in different legal areas and topics. If that's something that you want to lobby through your bars through to the IBA, we have a Bar Issues Commission division that deals with issues of interest to bars, which could take on that discussion and would go to a policy committee to decide, and then they would work with that member. So if that's something that you want to take offline with me, we could certainly talk about that, and I can tell you how we could perhaps navigate that suggestion internally.
Great, thank you. With that, I am going to hand the mic over to Katja so for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Tara. Well, at the World Economic Forum, we are in the convening business, in the multi-stakeholder coalition business, and I think that was really a good example here how important that is. You know, as Delia said, you know, the collective action, and that we are here at this conference, I think, and we have the engagement of the audience. I think that was really great, and I think that's something to definitely to follow up on. A couple of other points that we heard today, and that kind of really resonated with me. the issue of data quality, data sharing among companies, between the private sector and the public sector, and also maybe with civil society. I think we have a lot of data, and we are not able to access it and to share it. And we had a session this morning. It's really a lot of background noise, sorry. Having a party already, and we're coming to that.
They didn't think anybody would be in a meeting room at 7 o'clock.
Yeah, and so how can we also use, we had a session this morning on innovative technologies, and how can we also use technologies more to share data, to improve data quality, because I think that's one of the key issues if we want to do due diligence, KYC in the proper way. So I think something really to address. And also something we heard in a previous session is the importance of a culture of integrity. And I know maybe you think this is like a buzzword and we need regulations and sanctions. I think we need both. We need regulations, and in order for regulations to really be effective, we need the cultural change like in the private sector. We need to get the incentives right, and I think that's something that we continue to work on with our Gatekeepers task force.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, with that, would you please help me thank the panelists for their contribution?
Thank you very much.